Historic day on Capitol Hill. Testimony in a hearing for the Protect College Sports Act. Pete Bavacqua, the athletic director at Notre Dame, was there. Nick Saban, everybody knows who he is. He was there. Some other luminaries, industry people, even a player. Really an important day. And will it help get this thing brought to life? Will the Protect College Sports Act actually become a law and begin to redefine everything that's happening in college athletics? We're going to ask our guest. He covers college sports for the Sports Business Journal. It's our friend Ben Portnoy. Ben, easy question. It's a layup. What was your biggest takeaway from everything that happened on Capitol Hill this morning?
No, that's a good question. Good place to start. I think there were a couple of things. I think that, one of the things that I found really interesting is, and certainly Senator Ted Cruz and Maria Cantwell worked on this as a bipartisan bill and mentioned bits and pieces of this was, it was, there was a lot of sort of commendation, I would say, from both sides on the work that was done to put this together. I think there's a lot of support for this on both sides of the Senate. And I think that came out in the hearing. I think that there really is, this isn't to say that this is all going to be rubber stamped or anything like that or anything to that effect, but I do think that there's enough sentiment here that, hey, college sports is broken. There's no real level of governance. This is something that's really important to people across the country, and that Congress is in a position to actually help with this. And I think that came through. I think there were a couple other things. One thing I thought that was really interesting was some of what Notre Dame ADP Bavacqua talked about sort of toward the very tail end of the hearing. He was talking about the consolidation of media rights and basically whether that's something that makes sense, whether it's something he's in favor of, what it would actually entail. And, I think it's important to note, he was a former executive at NBC Sports. He was a former executive at the USGA. He negotiated a lot of these deals and is about as well versed in them as anyone. And one of the things he said was really, when you talk about pooling media rights, floats around a lot. Basically, the idea of being, instead of every conference having their own media deal, that it would fall under one banner and you negotiate together, that it would generate more revenue. He basically said in so many words, the only way that really totally makes sense is if you have a super league, and that's not something he's necessarily in favor of. So I thought those were two points that really stood out to me.
Yeah, but that seemed even kind of contradictory to me because here's a guy who's an expert, as you pointed out, in the field of media. I actually knew Pete when he was at NBC Sports, knew him when he was at the USGA. He knows what people want to see on TV. And then he laid out this really awesome TV schedule that would have the likes of Alabama playing non-conference games or whatever in a super league, or conference games in a super league with Ohio State and so forth. I thought he was sending mixed messages by doing that because I have to think that the people at the networks, after hearing something like that, became even more insistent that they become a super league because let's face it, those are the people who are pulling the strings here. Everything the ESCC is doing, everything the Big Ten is doing is predicated in large part upon their network partners. I'm not asking you to editorialize too much, but what's your response to that?
No, I think that's right. I think there's definitely, for lack of a better term, a little bit of talking out of both sides of the mouth. And frankly, Notre Dame would certainly be a school that's involved in a super league or something to that effect. But I do think that you're right. I think that it's a really interesting dynamic. And I think there's a couple things at play. And this is sort of away from the Senate hearing, but I think involves some of what was talked about is the reality is that college football and the way that it's structured right now is not really sustainable, for one. But two, I think that as you look at the growing divide between the Power 4 and the G6, and even within the Power 4, the SEC and the Big Ten, and then the ACC and the Big 12, there's just there's obviously a change in resources, and that gets exacerbated year over year. And so I think because of that, you're seeing a world where, the one thing that really could hold this whole thing together, I think, is a 24-team playoff, at least for the time being. Now, whether that happens, is that putting the cart before the horse as far as the leagues figuring out some of the governance things that they want, and whether Congress gets involved and so on and so forth. I don't know. We'll see what sort of order those things happen in, but I do think it all sort of ties together, and I think it's an interesting dynamic at play, to say the least.
We're joined by Ben Portnoy of the Sports Business Journal. Follow him on X at bportnoy15. Ben, just a couple more minutes, please. A lot of interesting stuff came out of the mouth of Nick Saban. I was shocked that he actually revealed how much Alabama spent on its roster with regards to NIL going back to the first year up until even what they spent last year, where he just, now correct me if I'm wrong, he has an office down the hall, right? He has his own deal at the football facility.
Correct, and he's making like $500,000 a year, I believe.
Yeah, so he's kind of telling everybody now what Kalen DeBoer is working with. I think he just upped the pressure on Kalen DeBoer.
Yeah, it was an interesting dynamic. He kind of spelled it out. I forget exactly what he said, but it was something along the lines of, it started out at 2.7, then we jumped to 7, then we got to 10, and then I retired, and then it was, then it was whatever, 17, then it was 24. And all of a sudden I was kind of listening and I was like, wait, did he like actually just say what he said? Like, is that actually what we're talking about right now? So I thought that was really funny, really interesting. But I will say it's interesting insight into like what are these schools really working with, and I think that if Alabama's working with 20, call it, and what Saban was really talking about was the collective. So, again, I don't know these numbers exactly and how they break down, but like if you're saying that Alabama's working with $24 million of essentially outside money, you got to think that their football program's working with a budget somewhere around, I don't know, 40, give or take, 35, 40. If you talk about the revenue share that's on top of that. So I thought that was a really interesting insight into kind of just what these programs are spending, have been spending, etc.
Yeah, and I also like how he began his testimony by about some things that stirred up. He said 5 or 6 years ago. It wasn't that long ago, but he was talking about a school that had a collective before collective really became part of our language with regards to college athletics. We know who he was talking about. We know he was talking about A&M, but he was a little more delicate this time around. A lot of interesting stuff from Nick Saban. Other than what he had to say, though, Ben, and I want to close out by discussing this. I found it really fascinating and really enlightening and encouraging. Perhaps that's the best word, encouraging, that a student athlete was involved. Lance Holtzclaw, defensive end at Utah, he gave testimony, and he gave us really both sides of the coin, especially with regards to agent relations. He said he's had good agent relations. He said he's seen rather bad agent relations with players. Kind of sum up for us what you thought of Lance Holtzclaw's testimony, and do you think that we'll see more student-athlete involvement as this process continues?
Well, I think two things. One, I think you're right. Like, I think what he was saying about the agent work and what that looks like and whether those, salaries should be capped, etc., I think was really fascinating. I think that there was, kind of to what you're saying, right? And I think there's a lot of hand waving and allusions to this idea of bad actors in the college sports space. And, I kind of joke about this a lot, but like the reality is kind of, excuse me. The reality is that, anyone with an Instagram and a cell phone can basically be an NIL agent these days. Like there's no certification, there's no, any kind of thing that you have to do in order to do that. And so I think that what was sort of enlightening in his conversation was exactly what you said, right? Like there's good actors, there's bad actors. I've had good relationships. I know people who haven't. I think that helps put a little bit of a face to a name to some of this stuff. Like I think a lot of this is hard for people to grasp and hard for, Joe fan to understand, just if only because I think it's sort of nameless, it's sort of faceless, and I think that's really hard. And I think that was really interesting. And I think that sort of the second part of your question, you're right. I think that, look, at the end of the day, there are very few. There's no real way that any of this stuff is really going to get progressed, or as realistically, like this probably ends up with a collective bargaining agreement somewhere down the line, and maybe that's 5 years, maybe that's 10 years, I don't know. But whenever it gets to a point that there's a collective bargaining agreement, athletes are going to have to be involved in this conversation. And I have a really hard time believing that you can sort of really fix college sports without athletes being involved. And I think that, there's been some athlete involvement in some of these hearings and things like that. And it's no knock on some of these athletes that have been involved. But look, there's a big difference when a high profile major college football player is speaking to their experience compared to, make up the sport, men's golfer, right? Like it's just, those are two very different worlds and two very different things. And I think that, it's helpful insight, I think, for a lot of people and for some of the senators too, to hear from someone who's like really actually at the tip of the spear on a lot of this.
And Ben, one thing I want to ask you, you're an expert in these things. If I'm a student athlete, I don't know that I want collective bargaining, at least not if I'm a football player or a basketball player. Collective bargaining to me would be a hindrance of me. I would have to adhere to certain rules. I would have a cap, a salary cap, for lack of a better phrase, that would be encountered. Right now, it's just get as much as you can for as quickly as you can for as long as you can. Collective bargaining would hinder that. But could that be something that would be overarching and maybe would perhaps pertain to all athletes, and that would be a way of saving the Olympic sports?
Yeah, no, what you're saying is a really good point, and I've asked a number of people this exact question of essentially like, if you're an athlete, what is your incentive to collectively bargain exactly right now? Because the reality is athletes in college sports right now can basically do whatever they want. Their contracts are essentially worth nothing, aren't worth the paper they're printed on. They're getting paid really well. The market's jumping 50% every offseason. Uh, there's just kind of no real, there's not really a lot of incentive for athletes to collectively bargain. Now, the flip side of that is, yes, are their kids being run off, and would there be protections and things like that might be stipulated and written in? Sure, like that actually does make some sense. There's some, I can see the rationale with some of that stuff. I think that certainly makes some sense.
And go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was gonna say, but I think that as it relates to all sports, like I think ultimately, and it's funny. I had this conversation with an administrator probably 4 or 5 years ago now, and it's interesting now looking at it back at it. But they basically said, what's gonna happen is you're gonna have a collective bargaining agreement with every single different sport, and it's gonna be football's gonna have its own, basketball's gonna have its own, so on, so on down the line. And I think it's gonna take years, but I think ultimately that's what's gonna happen.
We could have basically 20 different players unions, is what you're saying.
Yep, I think that's probably right. I like that to me seems like how this probably ends, which all of this is super messy and complicated, but that's generally speaking what I would imagine that ends up happening here.
Well, honestly, that makes the most sense when you think about it, because football and field hockey are vastly different sports with vastly different amounts of money tethered to them. Ben, before we let you go, and I hope I'm not catching you off guard, because I know you've been very deep with this legislation, this thing going on Capitol Hill. Do you have a reaction to NC State, Virginia being moved out of Brazil, going to be played in Charlottesville?
Yeah, I thought that was interesting. I saw that sort of in passing this morning. I don't have a ton of insight. I mean, I know I spoke with one person who was like mildly involved with that. And my understanding is that I think it's more on the organizer's side than it is the school side. I think the schools actually came out and even said as much. So I think it's a really interesting dynamic. I think that, this was something that, I'd spoken with some people who were involved in it at the front end, and seemed like it was all sort of put together and all, but I don't know if we're dealing with like a Firefest type thing or what, but I do think it's but I do think it's an interesting dynamic, and I would imagine there's more to this story to come than just a game cancellation.
Well, I mean, did we learn nothing from the 2016 Olympics or the World Cup? And also, Ben, the NFL is going to be down there in September. They got this thing called Rock in Rio going on right about the same time for two weekends. And I'm just going to be candid with it. I'll say it. You don't have to. NC State in Virginia doesn't really move the needle for me when it comes to picking an international trip. I don't see the logic in that. I don't see the logic in the entire venture, to be candid with you.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I think it's it's interesting. I talked to some people when this game came on the schedule, and I think that you did some reporting around the London game and one of the other London games as well. Uh, you know, I talked to some people who are kind of in that space and know like the international media rights space a little bit and international sort of football stuff. And it's really interesting in that like it's a hard thing to monetize in that like it's hard to get people to care about it, right? So like the NFL, you see what's going on now, right? Like this has been going on. These games in London have been going on for now what, 15, 20 years now basically.
Yeah.
Like there's a real history here. Getting people to care about teams like that, I think is easier than getting people to care about teams about colleges. It's such a uniquely American thing that I think like getting people to get interested in this overseas is a little bit more difficult. Now, is it impossible? No. And is that the reason that this isn't happening? Not necessarily, but I do think it is an interesting thing worth monitoring is like, as the NFL and the NBA try to push into Europe and things like that. For college sports, is there a window there? I think there's, listen, there's a hell of a lot of other things that college sports are trying to worry about right now, but it's an interesting sort of like subplot to this other stuff going on.
I'll leave you with this thought. That NFL shield resonates with way more people outside the United States than any college logo.
100%. 100%. That's exactly what it is.
And also, and you don't have to respond to this one given the nature of your work, but at the end of the day, who would you rather have negotiating a deal to go play overseas or to do something landmark or unique? Brett Yormark or Jim Phillips? Brett Yormark is the master of doing different. I think this turns out different if he's operating it. Jim Phillips, I don't know. That's my 2 cents. So, leave it at that, Ben. He's Ben Portnoy, the Sports Business Journal. Follow him on X at bportnoy15. Ben, you're the man, brother. As always, appreciate your time.
Appreciate you, Scott. Thanks for having me, brother.
All right. That's Ben Portnoy, the Sports Business Journal. This is Connecting Carolina, 107.5 The Game.